Tom, thank you very, very much. And it's very, very good to be back here in Delphi. You know, I'm obviously a little freer to say things than some others around the table, but let me just offer a couple of thoughts from my vantage point, which is basically an American expatriate living in Brussels, which is, you know, who comes here frequently. And really let me just make 3 points, and maybe just first a little point about the title of the session. I think, frankly, that what we're looking at is not so much discussing a new world order, whatever that may be, but rather kind of the end of complacency about what exists now. And that there's a subtle but very important difference between those two things. And I'll say a bit more about that. 3 points, really. 2 myths and a reality. The first myth, I think, is about this myth of US disengagement in the world. I just don't, frankly, see it, at least in a very physical, tangible sense. I mean, in the last session, we talked a great deal about what was happening at Suda Bay, what's going on in other places around the world. If you look at the American security presence in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, these are not places where the United States is leaving. If anything, in some of these places, we are doing a lot more, we're spending more, we're more present. And we're still a key security guarantor in all of those spheres. So the idea that somehow we're disengaging from these places in security terms, I think is wrong. That said, I mean, clearly at the level of diplomacy and strategy and the sort of gap between what the international community expects and what we're delivering, it's a different issue. And there is clearly a much sharper, more carefully measured approach to the use of American power. And certainly relative to previous administrations, Republican and Democratic, I would say, I'd be interested in what our colleagues think, there is less emphasis on the values agenda, on the democratization agenda, on things of that kind, and much more on sovereignty and national interest. The second point is, I think there's also a myth that this somehow started with President Trump, this kind of new look, this kind of skepticism about the foreign and security policy canon, and it clearly didn't. I mean, even in the Obama administration, you know, the president was pretty clear about some of his kind of challenging of the foreign policy establishment's solutions on a number of different fronts, including Afghanistan and other things. So there's nothing really in a way new about that, and clearly on Capitol Hill, I think there's been a mood like that for a long time. The burden sharing argument about Europe paying more and doing more in its own defense. This is an old story. Multiple administrations, Republican, Democratic, have made this point, some of them very vigorously. So that's also not particularly new. The focus on Asia relative to other things as a place where great power competition is deepening, and that's clearly so, and it's reflected in the national security strategy. But this emphasis on Asia didn't start with President Trump. His predecessor was also focused on this, and even before that it was an issue. So this has been on the American agenda for a long time, and you know, and it may well be, I don't actually think it's so, but you could speculate, and it's an interesting year to do that, that we're looking at a kind of a shift away from a 100-year US pivot to Europe. The third point I would make finally is the reality part of this. And here, you know, we could have a debate, but I think there is now a very different kind of mood, attitude, policy when it comes to international engagement coming out of Washington. Maybe some of this came out of the campaign, I don't know. There actually was a lot of international policy in the campaign, but it struck me, I don't know if you would agree, I'm interested to hear, that a lot of it was derivative of kind of the American domestic debate about trade, about kind of terrorism, about migration. These were the things that were kind of on the top of the international agenda, and kind of classical issues of alliance commitments and other things were lower down. Is there the capacity for diplomacy and strategy of the kind that American partners would like? So they want predictability, you're absolutely right, Tom, but they also expect kind of grand strategy from the United States, and in fact, that's not what you usually get from administrations. You get a lot of crisis management, quite naturally. But, I mean, I would be concerned that this far into the administration, there are still lots of key positions unfilled. I live in Brussels, there's still no American ambassador to the European Union. There's not even a name that I'm aware of. That's a big difference. That's a big difference. And just finally, and the last few days have underscored this, I think there is a question of how you connect the dots in terms of strategy. I don't think you can do what is being proposed on trade policy in the last few days even, and not expect that to have an effect on security relationships around the world. It will, and allies are already talking about that. What do I really worry about in all of this? It's that out of this nationalization, it leads to others' nationalization, and you get a kind of cascading effect which makes everything less predictable and a lot of things more risky.